Hiram Maxim, this guy, was born in Maine, ended up in Britain, and gave the world some 260 inventions, like a type of telegraph, which the Samuel Morse model outsold by a huge margin. But then Maxim also invented a curling iron, steam pumps, a different kind of mousetrap, and he later claimed the light bulb. Take that, Thomas Edison. When it came to warfare, Maxim thought it should be more humane, reduce all that pain and suffering. He came up with the Maxim machine gun. Before the century was out, his gun had performed so well that Queen Victoria bestowed a knighthood on Maxim. Over the last 150 years, its descendants have eliminated nearly all the world's pain and suffering. Good show, Sir Hiram. In 1894, Maxim completed his aeronautical masterpiece, the Great Kite of War. And great it was, 145 feet long, with a wingspan that measured 104 feet from tip to tip. That comes to a whopping 4,000 square feet of wing. Maxim tossed in a pair of 180 horsepower steam engines, each light enough to be curled by the 49-year-old Hiram himself. All right, kids, that's what a 49-year-old guy looked like in 1889. Wear sunscreen. Maxim added horizontal control surfaces that moved, so the great kite could climb and descend. To turn, Maxim relied on divergent thrust. That is, really pour on the steam to one engine, which turned its propeller faster, while the other propeller remained spinning at the same speed and essentially braking that wingtip. The great kite would spin around that point. Altogether, size-wise, the Great Kite of War really needed to go on a strict diet. It weighed 3.5 tons, which to be fair wasn't as heavy as a railroad freight car. Maxim thought it was wise to put it on railroad tracks anyway. And while it was supposed to be a flying machine, Maxim seemed to want to keep the flying part down to a minimum. His crew placed a wooden handrail just high enough to keep it from flying off the rails, literally. With a journalist recording the actions for posterity, the great kite started rolling down the tracks. Suddenly it jumped and plowed through the handrail. Maxim cut power. The great kite dropped like an anvil, an extremely fragile anvil. After the dust settled, Maxim realized that machine guns were just easier. Too bad he didn't stick with it a little longer, enough to give divergent thrust a try. Okay, here's why. In 1985, a 3-engine DC-10 airliner was innocently jetting over Iowa with 296 people on board when suddenly the rear engine exploded. Molten metal fragments severed all the hydraulic lines. The only controls left were the divergent thrust of 2 surviving engines. Okay, this is where it gets kind of cool. A United pilot named Denny Finch was deadheading in first class. Finch traveled a lot, namely because he trained United's pilots in emergency procedures using full-motion flight simulators. Over the next 44 minutes, the 3 pilots together flew on engine thrust alone, and they nearly reached Sioux City too. But a wing dipped and touched the runway. The airplane exploded. Of 296 passengers and crew on board, 112 died. But 184 survived. You can bet that crash made the news. NASA put its best man on it, astronaut Gordon Fullerton. Fullerton had been on the backup crew of Apollos 14, 15, 16, and 17, and he had flown the space shuttle twice before ending up at Edwards Air Force Base figuring out how to land an MD-11 widebody on divergent thrust alone. with additional computing power thrown in, of course. In other words, Sir Hiram Maxim's divergent thrust wired. After NASA published its findings, aircraft manufacturers thought it sounded valuable in future airplanes, but they won't install it unless they have to.